On the evening of April 6, 1994, the skies over Rwanda glowed with the fire of an explosion. A plane carrying the country's president, Juvenal Habyarimana, was shot down as it approached Kigali Airport. Within hours, the sound of machetes replaced the sound of engines. The streets were filled with screams, and the smell of smoke and death spread across the hills. What followed was one of the fastest genocides in human history. More than 800,000 people killed in just 100 days. But this story did not begin with that explosion. It began years earlier, in quiet offices thousands of miles away, in Washington, London, and Paris, where the fate of a small African nation was decided as part of a much larger game. In the late 1980s, Rwanda was a fragile state, ruled by an authoritarian government and scarred by decades of ethnic division between the Hutu majority and Tutsi minority. After waves of persecution, hundreds of thousands of Tutsi had fled the country, many settling in Uganda. These refugees had lost everything, their homes, their families, their identity. But they hadn't lost their desire to return. Among them were young men who joined the Ugandan army under President Yoweri Museveni, a man rising to power with the silent support of the West. In the barracks of Uganda, these refugees were trained, disciplined, and hardened by war. They would become the foundation of a new military force, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or RPF. Among their leaders were Fred Ruigema and a quiet, calculating officer named Paul Kagame. At that same time, a shift was taking place in global politics. The Cold War was ending. The Soviet Union was collapsing. For the United States and Britain, Africa was no longer about fighting communism. It was about influence, economic, political, and military. France, under President François Mitterrand, had dominated Central Africa for decades, backing regimes from Zaire to Rwanda. Washington and London wanted to break that influence. Museveni, their new ally in Uganda, became the key. He promised that with the right support, his country could become the new center of Western power in East and Central Africa. It was a promise they accepted. Quietly, Western intelligence agencies began looking the other way as Uganda supported the CIA authorized shipments of what were called non-lethal aid packages, but these included thousands of automatic rifles, rocket launchers, and millions of rounds of ammunition. The weapons moved through secret routes, their origin disguised. British officers arrived in Uganda, offering training assistance to what they called regional stability forces. In reality, they were training rebels for a war that had not yet been declared. On the night of October 1, 1990, as most of Rwanda slept, about 4,000 RPF fighters crossed the Ugandan border. Their uniforms were Ugandan, their weapons Western. It was the start of a war that would tear the country apart. The Rwandan government, unprepared and under-equipped, called for help from its ally, France. French troops and advisors arrived quickly. They saw what was happening, a Western-backed rebel movement trying to overthrow a French-backed government. Rwanda had become the battlefield of a proxy war. In the early years of the conflict, the RPF suffered setbacks. Their commander, Fred Ruigema, was killed on the second day of fighting. Leadership passed to Paul Kagame, who had been studying military tactics in the United States. He returned from Fort Leavenworth to take control of the rebellion. The timing was no coincidence. Washington knew exactly who Kagame was and what he was capable of. Under his command, the RPF reorganized, strengthened, and began a war of attrition that would last 4 years. By 1993, international pressure was growing to end the bloodshed. Peace talks were held in Arusha, Tanzania. France proposed an arms embargo on both sides to calm the situation. But Britain, backed by the United States, quietly blocked it. The reason was strategic. An embargo would cut off weapons to both sides. But the RPF already had their supply lines through Uganda, while the Rwandan government relied on open arms purchases. Blocking the embargo meant the government would weaken, and the rebels would gain the upper hand. Diplomatically, London and Washington continued to speak of peace, but their silence on Uganda's role told a different story. Inside Rwanda, tension was reaching a breaking point. Ethnic propaganda flooded the radio waves. Extremist militias were being armed by the government. The country was a powder keg, and all it needed was a spark. That spark came on April 6, 1994, when the president's plane was shot down. To this day, no one has definitively proven who fired the missile, but many believe it was the RPF, and that the attack had been planned to destroy the last obstacle between them and power. In the days before the crash, Western diplomats had warned President Habyarimana that if he delayed signing the peace accords, he would face the consequences alone. When his plane went down, those words became chillingly prophetic. Within hours, roadblocks appeared across Kigali. The Presidential Guard and extremist militias began targeting Tutsis and moderate Hutus. Men, women, and children were dragged from their homes, beaten, and hacked to death. The genocide had begun. At the same time, the RPF launched a full-scale offensive. Their troops advanced rapidly, capturing town after town as the world watched in silence. In New York, the United Nations debated intervention. The UN peacekeeping mission in Rwanda, commanded by Canadian General Romeo Dallaire, pleaded for reinforcements. None came. The United States, still haunted by its failed mission in Somalia a year earlier, refused to send troops. Britain followed suit. Even worse, both countries pushed for the withdrawal of existing UN forces, leaving only a few hundred peacekeepers on the ground. France, seeing its influence collapse, launched its own limited operation, but it came too late. By July 1994, the RPF had captured Kigali. Paul Kagame declared victory. The genocide stopped, not because the world intervened, but because there was no one left to kill. Nearly 1 million people were dead. The Western powers quickly recognized the new government and reopened embassies. Kagame was hailed as a hero, and the RPF was described as a force of stability and reconciliation. Aid money poured into Rwanda, and Kagame became one of Washington's most trusted African allies. The narrative was rewritten. The West had helped end the genocide, but the truth was darker. As RPF soldiers consolidated power, millions of Hutu refugees fled into neighboring Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo. Kagame's forces pursued them, claiming they were hunting down the killers. But the pursuit turned into another massacre. Entire refugee camps were bombed and burned. The world called it chaos. Kagame called it justice. Behind the scenes, Western intelligence and military advisors once again provided logistical support. Satellite images from American surveillance helped track the movement of refugees. By 1996, Rwanda and Uganda invaded Zaire together, toppling its longtime dictator Mobutu Sese Seko. The West celebrated it as the fall of another corrupt regime. What followed, however, was the First Congo War, and then the second, conflicts that would kill more than 5 million people. Years later, a former U.S. official, Prudence Bushnell, admitted what many already suspected. "We knew what the dangers of supporting the RPF were," she said. "But at that time, we felt it was more important to control Libya and push France back." Those words revealed what the genocide truly was, not a sudden eruption of tribal hatred, but a geopolitical calculation. Human lives were reduced to numbers on a chessboard. The media coverage of the time completed the illusion. Television networks in the West presented the story as one of tribal violence, a tragedy of Africans killing Africans, while helpless foreign diplomats looked on. They never mentioned the years of Western training, weapons, and political maneuvering that set the stage for the slaughter. They never showed that the very powers who claimed to mourn Rwanda's tragedy had helped create it. Félicien Kabuga, one of the main financiers of the genocide, managed to vanish after the killings ended. He withdrew millions of dollars from his Swiss bank accounts and lived comfortably across Europe for more than 2 decades. He was finally arrested in France, not because of a breakthrough investigation, but because his usefulness had ended. For 26 years, he had been a fugitive whom everyone knew how to find, but no one wanted to. In this dark web of politics and profit, Kabuga was just one of many who played both sides. He had funded Hutu extremists who carried out the massacres, but he had also maintained connections with those in the RPF. His power came from money, and from the silence of the nations that should have stopped him. By the late 1990s, the pattern had become clear. Across Africa and the Middle East, dictators, warlords, and insurgent groups were being armed, funded or shielded by the same global powers that spoke endlessly about democracy and human rights. Officially, the goal was stability, Unofficially, it was control. Control of resources, routes, and regimes. Decades later, American Senate hearings would reveal that even humanitarian programs like USAID had, at times, been used to fund organizations linked to violence and terrorism. The Rwandan Genocide was not an isolated event. It was a warning, a glimpse into how modern empires operate. The victims were not only those who died in 1994, but also the millions who perished in the wars that followed. From the hills of Kigali to the jungles of Congo, the echoes of that single plane crash still haunt the region. Today, Paul Kagame is celebrated by many as the man who rebuilt Rwanda. Under his rule, the country has achieved economic growth and a reputation for order. But beneath the surface lies a nation haunted by fear and silence. Opposition voices disappear. Journalists are jailed. The same discipline that once made the RPF a formidable army now keeps an entire population in line. Kagame remains a close ally of the United States and Britain. Proof that in international politics, loyalty often matters more than justice. When we look back at Rwanda, we must ask not only how such horror was possible, but who allowed it to happen. The answer lies not only in the streets of Kigali, but in the corridors of Washington, London, and Paris. It lies in the secret memos, the silent meetings, the calculated indifference. For the people of Rwanda, history was written in blood. For the powers that shaped it, it was written in strategy. When we hear news from Africa or the Middle East today, stories of civil wars, insurgencies, or peacekeeping operations, we should remember what happened here. We should remember how easily noble words were used to disguise ruthless ambition, and how many lives were lost so that global influence could shift from one empire to another. The genocide in Rwanda was not just a tragedy. It was a mirror reflecting the true face of international politics, a reminder that behind every slogan of peace, there can be the silence of complicity. And that silence, history has shown, kills more than bullets ever could.